Hello, I'm Thom Hartmann, and welcome to a special edition of The Big Picture. Tonight, we're partnering up with the Campaign for America's Future to bring you a special teach-in on the U.S. economy. Campaign for America's Future is also joining forces with Rebuild the Dream Organizing Network, MoveOn.org, and Free Speech TV, and other groups around the nation that have spread the word about tonight's program. Together, these groups have organized local teach-ins where people are tuning into this program in universities, union halls, and community centers around the country. We're calling this whole thing the National TV Teach-In to take back the American dream. So thanks for tuning in, and a special hello to the local teach-ins watching around the nation. So, why are we here? Well, we're here because our nation is in a difficult time, in a desperate need of real solutions to get Americans back to work, to create a sustainable economy that benefits not just the top 1%, but all Americans, and to make the United States competitive once again in the global marketplace. We're also here to discuss what ideas won't work and why. Tonight we'll set the record straight and offer specific and popular policies that Congress and President Obama can get to work on immediately to get us back on track. We're going to focus tonight on three main questions. Number one, why and how we almost plunged into a second Great Depression a few years ago. Two, what kind of future will Americans have if conservatives control the economy? And finally, three, how do we rebuild the American dream? Luckily, we're not alone to find answers to these questions. In fact, we're joined by a very impressive panel. Alongside me here in the studio, Robert Borosage, the co-director of the Campaign for America's Future, and a Center for Ideas and Action that works to build an enduring majority for progressive change. Campaign for America's Future also runs an annual gathering of progressives called Take Back the American Dream. Heather McGhee is the director of Demos's office, Washington office. Demos, yeah.
That's right, you have it.
Heather is also Deputy Public Policy Director for Domestic and Economic Policy on the 2008 John Edwards for President campaign, and she co-authored a chapter on retirement insecurity in the book Inequality Matters, The Growing Economic Divide in America and Its Poisonous Consequences. Leo Hindery is the chairman of the Economic Growth Smart Globalization Initiative at the New America Foundation and a member on the Council on Foreign Relations. Leo is currently an investor in media companies and is the former CEO of Telecommunications Inc., Liberty Media, and their successor AT&T Broadband. Natalie Foster is the co-founder of Rebuild the Dream, an organization focused on strengthening working families by creating good jobs and making sure that all Americans pay their fair share of taxes. Natalie was pivotal in organizing more than 900 House meetings across the United States in mid-July, where those attending selected priority issues and created the contract for the American dream. And finally, joining us from the University of California, Berkeley, is Robert Reich, the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy at UC Berkeley and former Secretary of Labor under President Bill Clinton. He's the author of 13 books, including his most recent, Aftershock, The Next Economy and America's Future. Welcome to all of you. Glad to have you here with us. Let's get started with issue number one, how the 1% crashed the economy and plunged the U.S. into a deep recession with a slow recovery. Robert, let me start with you. Let's set the stage for what President Obama inherited when he took office. George Bush had a pretty abysmal job creation record. The average monthly job growth for prime-age workers was at its lowest during the Bush administration than any time since 1948, and that doesn't include what happened in 2007. This chart number one here, in 2007, unemployment stood at 4.4%. And by the time Barack Obama took office in January 2009, 4 million Americans had lost their jobs. The economy was in free fall, with 400,000 people a month getting thrown out of work. And by November of 2010, the unemployment rate had soared to 9.8%. So what caused the economic stagnation during the Bush administration and the eventual 2008 meltdown?
Well, the stagnation comes from the economy headed into a lot of headwinds. Wages were declining. The top 1% was capturing literally all the rewards of growth during that decade. We were hemorrhaging manufacturing jobs. And so what you could get was slow growth, despite large deficits, despite low interest rates. And what that produced was a massive bubble. What drove the economy off the cliff, so that it was in free fall, as you put it, when Obama inherited it, was not an accident. It was really a crime. This was the banking financial community, the big banks, the hedge fund operators, using their political power to remove the safety protections that were built during the New Deal and kept banking boring. They took those apart. They then managed to stop any new regulations. And they had a wilding. They went on a wild drive. They turned the mortgage market into a casino. They got higher and higher and made bigger and bigger bets until, careening out of control, they literally drove the economy off the cliff.
And it looks like they're fixing to do it again, or they're ginning it back up again. It's pretty remarkable. Heather, clearly the 2008 crisis didn't happen overnight. There must have been some deep structural issues in our economy. We have a chart here, chart number 2 on wealth inequality, shows the amount of wealth concentrated in just the top 10% wealthiest Americans began steadily climbing upward right after 2002. I'm assuming this corresponds with the Bush tax cut, but you could tell us. And by 2008 had reached levels not seen since before the 1929 stock market crash. So how did this growing wealth inequality lead to the 2008 crash?
The way to create a sound economy that is sustainable is truly to have a strong middle class. And so if you look at that long period of time where after the Great Depression, after the first Gilded Age, where we had pretty much in shocking sort of mirror of what happened in this great crash, you saw this period where we all grew together. We had a strong middle class with good jobs, where you had communities that could actually thrive. And so you saw that the wealth was more commonly shared among people. When you have a situation where only the gains are going to the top, you're basically running an economy on fumes, and that's what we saw. So Bob mentioned the housing bubble. You had basically the middle class using their houses as an ATM. Mm-hmm. And all of that money, all of the debt, the creditors was a very wealthy class, banks, hedge funds, speculators on Wall Street. And so it was a really upside down and unbalanced economy. And so the structural problems we had that really led to the middle class not being able to finance their daily expenses without going into debt, without borrowing to make ends meet, was a really important part of destabilizing our economy to a place where we could have the crash in 2008. So when we are able to rebuild the middle class, we're going to have a much stronger, more stable economy for everyone.
From your lips to God's ears. Secretary Reich, let's push back on some of the conservative talking points here. Conservative analysts love to blame the housing bubble and collapse on liberal efforts to get banks to make more loans within their communities. They argue that liberals and government-regulated Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac forced banks to make loans to people who clearly weren't qualified. Secretary Reich, you've looked at this question. What role did these so-called liberal reform policies play in the housing bubble and the ensuing economic collapse?
Well, Tom, there's absolutely no evidence that so-called, liberal economic efforts to expand housing were the key cause here. I mean, we know that there was a lot of predatory lending going on to not poor people, but to lower middle class, average working people. The banks were basically borrowing money very, very cheaply, and in fact, under Alan Greenspan, they could get money basically almost at zero cost. And when you can get money that cheaply, well, how do you make money? Well, you make money by pushing the money out in terms of loans. And so the banks were basically providing loans to anybody who could stand up straight. They were doing it. Many of these loans, these mortgage loans, were, had balloon clauses at the end. People didn't even know what they were getting. Now, you might say people should have been aware, but I don't know about you. I've bought houses before. It's not easy to go through line by line and know exactly what you're doing. You have to trust that somebody knows what they're doing, and trust basically was not called for because the banks were trying desperately to move the money to create loans, to create this entire subprime loan market that padded the pockets of a lot of very, very wealthy investment bankers and traders and others, but who ended up holding the bag? Well, it was a lot of average working people who discovered that once the bubble burst, they were underwater.
Mm-hmm. And Leo Hindery, as soon as President Obama came into office, he passed the Americans Recovery and Reinvestment Act, known as the Stimulus Act. Chart 3 here is showing a clear line of demarcation from when the Stimulus Act was passed and an uptick in job creation numbers. You're a prominent businessman. Did you support what President Obama did to stimulate the economy? And if so, can you describe the results and why conservatives are calling the Stimulus Act a failure?
I think there was one clear message, Tom, out of the 2008 election, and that is we are very broken as an economy. We're very united as a citizenry to try to fix this. A bipartisan, nonpartisan response to the travails that Bob and Heather have described for us, as the Secretary as well. Clearly, you can't look at that chart and not believe that the Stimulus Act was a plug in the leaking dike. I come from the school that I think it was misdirected. I think it was underfunded. But I certainly don't come from a school that says we shouldn't have done it at all. I would have put a great deal more resources at it. I think Secretary Reich has spoken about that in the past. I would have done much more focus on the job creation aspects of it. Stimulus can only mean one thing, Tom. Does it create jobs? It's not supposed to be palliative. It's not supposed to correct societal ills. It's supposed to create jobs. And Bob Borosage and I have often talked about the real unemployment travail that still burdens this country. We still have 27 million women and men in real terms who are unemployed or underemployed. So despite the success of the stimulus effort, it wasn't enough. So it's very disheartening now to listen to conservatives say we shouldn't have done that in the first place, and for gosh sakes, don't do any more.
Right. Which brings me to a question for you, Natalie. The Stimulus Act was really the only stimulus that President Obama was able to get through. There were a number of other good pieces that would have stimulated the economy, but they got filibustered in the Senate. In the minute we have left in this segment, your thoughts on where should we, what should we do if we had a majority in the House?
Yeah, I'd just say, look, in 2010, the conversation was about cuts to the social safety net, to the lifeline that many Americans needed, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, instead of a conversation about investing in jobs, about expanding health care, and about, real Wall Street reform. And that's what this country needed at that time. And luckily, I think you're starting to see that change. I think you're starting to see the conversation shift toward jobs and investment, and I think that's important.
And hopefully it'll keep going in that direction. Thanks for everybody for getting this teach-in off to a good start. It's time to take our first break. Coming up, what will our future look like if conservatives continue to control our politics and our economy?
Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the...
It's all designed to keep you closed in your own small world as a prisoner.
You leave somebody in there for a couple hours like that in a stress position.
You have this fear of the unknown and this stress sort of building and building.
I've seen interrogations go on 10, 12 hours.
They chose songs I remember from Marilyn Manson and Metallica. And
Slayer, the two songs would be Angel of Death and Raining Blood.
When we're killing the enemy, going through war, coming up here into Iraq, coming into Baghdad, drowning pool, let the bodies hit the floor.
We're just a rock and roll band.
It was fitting for the job we were doing.
Wealthy British scion Zach Wilson, investment activist.
Markets, finance, scandal. Find out what's really happening to the global economy with Max Kaiser for a no-holds-barred look at the global financial headlines. Tune in to Kaiser Report on RT.
Welcome back to the special teach-in for the American Dream edition of The Big Picture. I'm Thom Hartmann. For this segment, we're moving on to question number 2. What happens to the American dream if conservatives win the next election or control the Congress and continue to impose their economic priorities on the American people? To begin, I want to play a video that you made, Secretary Reich, that I think sets the stage perfectly for this discussion. Take a look.
What's the problem with the economy? Let me connect the dots and show you the big picture in less than 2 minutes, 15 seconds. Dot 1. Since 1980, the American economy has doubled in size. But adjusting for inflation, most people's wages have barely increased. Second dot. Where did all that money go? Almost all the gains have gone to the super rich. The top 1% used to take home about 10% of total income. Now it takes home more than 20%. And the super rich have 40% of the nation's entire wealth. The third dot. All this money at the top has given the super rich lots of political power, especially power to lower their tax rates. Before 1980, the top tax rate was over 70%. Now it's down to 35%. And much of their income is capital gains, subject to only a 15% tax. According to the IRS, the richest 400 Americans pay only 17%. Fourth dot. This means huge budget deficits. Tax revenues are down to less than 15% of the total economy, the lowest in 60 years. So public services are being cut at all levels of government. Our kids are being crowded into classrooms with more and more other children. Roads, bridges, levees, healthcare, safety nets, they're all being sacrificed. The fifth dot. Instead of joining together for better wages and jobs, many people are so scared that they're competing with other working people for the scraps that are left behind. So we get union versus non-union, public employee versus private, native-born versus immigrants. Final dot. The vast middle class, unable to borrow as it could before, no longer has the purchasing power needed to get the economy growing again, which means continued high unemployment and an anemic recovery. So you see the big picture? The only way we can have a strong economy is with a strong middle class.
So, Secretary Reich, you mentioned that the only way we can have a strong economy is with a strong middle class, but as the chart number 4 is showing right now, the size of the middle class has been steadily falling since 1970. Not only that, so too has the middle class's share of income in America, which might have something to do with declining union membership, as chart number 5 shows. As union membership has declined since the late 60s, so too has the share of national wealth owned by the middle class. Yet conservatives are proposing more tax cuts for the top 1%, cuts to the social safety net, ending Medicare as we know it, firing public workers, not to mention the war on unions in states like Wisconsin, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan. So what effect will these conservative policies have on the decreasing middle class that you just identified?
Tom, the conservative policies will make things far worse, concentrating income and wealth and political power to an even greater extent at the very top of society. We know that trickle-down economics has proven a cruel joke. Nothing trickles down. That means the rest of us will, in all likelihood, barely see any wage increase at all. We would see probably unemployment again going very, very high. We would probably see a spike, as we have already seen, in the poverty rate in this country. And all of the social discord, all of the anger and stress that people are feeling would be far worse. The only way out, instead of a regressive direction, and that's the way the conservatives want to move us, it's not conservative, it really is regressive. Instead of a regressive direction, the only way out is a progressive direction, which includes a truly progressive income tax, good public services and public investments in education and infrastructure, an enlarged earned income tax credit, that is wage subsidies, or for people all the way up to $50,000, and a renewed sense and a renewed emphasis on getting big money out of politics.
Heather, as chart number 6 here shows, there's a clear correlation between lower top income tax rates, shown in blue in this chart, and more debt, shown in red. And not only that, since the Reagan tax cuts were passed in 1980, it's gotten worse. And chart number 7, prior to 1979, income inequality was relatively balanced among the 5 economic groups. But after 79, income growth for the 99%, in some cases actually went down, while the top 1% has exploded. So should we expect anything other than more debt and more massive wealth inequality if conservatives control government.
Not at all. I mean, we've already seen a great promise that Representative Paul Ryan showed the American people exactly what he would do if he were in charge of the federal government. He would end Medicare as we know it. He would end Medicaid. He would cut taxes in half for the wealthiest 1% while raising them for the working and middle class, and permanently cap our ability in this country to respond to urgent national needs. So the sort of long and short of all of those different policies, which really feel like a sort of doubling down on the trickle-down economic theory, are not only that working families would be much worse off, but that we would have, in fact, rising debt. It's not rocket science to say that if you continue to cut taxes and continue to refuse to invest in the economy that grows the real economy, you're going to actually have rising debt, which is exactly what Paul Ryan says that he's trying to address with this draconian budget.
You know, the real catastrophe here is what Heather called doubling down. These people are advocating exactly the same policies that drove us off the cliff, that created the inequality, that created the declining wages, that hemorrhaged the manufacturing sector of this society. And they haven't changed a comma in the mantra that they do in terms of what they are for. So instead of having the debate we should be having about a much bigger set and bolder set of programs than we have now to actually deal with the challenges we face, we are instead having a debate about, are we going to stay with these policies that are at least have stemmed the free fall, or are we going to go back into the policies that drove us to ruin?
And Natalie, aren't these the same policies that the Republicans were pushing in the 1920s? I mean, this is basically Hoover, Coolidge, or Harding, Coolidge, Hoover. It's like rinse, wash, recycle. In fact, chart number 8 shows 1 in 3 working families are now low income. Hourly pay has barely increased in 30 years. 4 million homes have been foreclosed on. 1 in 4 homeowners are underwater. 25 million Americans can't find enough work. It just, goes on. And so, are we on the verge of a lost generation of Americans?
Well, Tom, my generation knows that we will never do as well as our parents, that there are far less jobs, there's far less security, and costs are rising, and that's just a reality we face. And that's in part why we're in the streets all over the country, and that's in part why you've seen, a real rise against the policies that everyone has been talking about. When I think of what's wrong in this country, I think of Raphael, who's a friend of ours. He's from Ohio, and he served this country and did a year in Iraq, did everything this country asked of him, and then he went to college on the GI Bill, but it wasn't enough because tuitions has gone up so much. He's now $40,000 in debt and working his way through life to pay off that debt, who did everything this country asked of him, there are many, many like him throughout this last generation.
Yeah, it really is a bizarre shift. I mean, I worked my way through college as a DJ in a gas station. My wife worked her way through college as a waitress in a Howard Johnson's. And my mom worked her way through college in the 40s, washing airplanes at the airport. You just can't do that anymore. Leo Hindery, free trade has become a bipartisan issue with Democrats and Republicans both supporting it. Chart 11 shows our trade deficits have been exploding since the 1990s. With the exception of the last few years, thanks to the economic downturn. Chart 12 shows that along with our increasing trade deficits, manufacturing is playing a smaller and smaller role in our economy. Do trade deficits matter? And why isn't anybody talking about them? Why hasn't there been a discussion about manufacturing policy in America in the last 30 years of any consequence?
Tom, you can listen well and soberly to Natalie and Heather describe where we are today. And it is deplorable, as Secretary Reich has described. I'm even harsher as to how we got here. I think I go back to 1980, and I think we, for 30 years, have decided that we can, in fact, live with trade deficits, that somehow that's not a debt that we have to be paying attention to. But more fundamentally, and this goes back to some of Secretary Reich's comments, we also decided that we can survive as a large economy, the largest economy, with only 8 or 9% of women and men actually in the manufacturing sector. So the credit crisis that Bob led us into at the opening of his comments, Secretary Reich followed on, was a consequence of the fact that we are so dramatically overweighted to the service sector. Right. The only way you can survive an economy like that is through credit, through these credit bubbles. If we don't change the trade deficit off of that one chart, this roughly $600 billion a year, half in manufactured goods, mostly to China, half in oil and gas. That is accumulating at such a dramatic rate that the world that Heather aspires to, and Natalie, you'll never see it. If we don't get more women and men, roughly a quarter of manufacturing, women and men in manufacturing, about a quarter of the workforce, you will never catch up in that environment as well. The world that Secretary Reich characterizes that off of his earlier segment, where he said, look just how cruel we have created this nation. There is no middle. I don't even know who the middle class is. I think it's everybody but the top 10%. And it's a consequence of trade policies run amok and insensitivity to labor in general, and particularly to the manufacturing sector.
So, Bob, Borosage, what do we do about this?
Well, I think you have to have a set of new policies that make a dramatic difference in our policy. For example, we've got to have a much more serious trade policy. You can't run deficits of $1 billion, $1.5 billion a day, where you're borrowing that money from abroad. You can't allow China, which is playing by a very different set of rules than we are, to use those rules in a mercantilist way to take over our industries and to target our industries and erase them. You've got to stand up with a set of policies that defend this country and not allow the multinational sector to drive our trade policy.
We had tariffs from 1797 until basically the Reagan administration started deconstructing them. Most other countries, if you look at Japan, Germany, Taiwan, South Korea, China, they all have VAT taxes that they reverse out when they export and that they double down when they import, which function as tariffs. We have nothing. We got no tariffs. We got no VAT taxes.
And we have no strategy.
We have no discussion, actually,
manufacturing in this.
Well, what we do
society.
have is a trade deficit that's unparalleled in history. That's what we do have. Well, because it enriches the people that Natalie and you were talking about. It's so self-serving to the large corporation, the multinational corporation, and to the women and men who have the privilege of running those corporations, that it's to be expected. This is by design. This is not by happenstance. This structural breakage is by design, and that's what we should probably talk about in the next segment.
Yeah, this is almost like Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism. All right, so clearly the path that conservatives want to take us down is a dark one, but when we come back, we'll turn the corner. After the break, what needs to be done to turn things around and take back the American dream?
Wealthy British scion Zach Wilson, investment activist
Markets, finance, scandal. Find out what's really happening to the global economy with Max Kaiser for a no-holds-barred look at the global financial headlines. Tune in to Kaiser Report on RT.
Welcome back to the Teach-In to Take Back the American Dream. And once again, hello to all those local teach-ins taking place around the country. I'm joined in the studio by Robert Borosage, co-director of the Campaign for America's Future, Heather McGhee, director of Demos's Washington office, Leo Hindery, chairman of the Economic Growth Smart Globalization Initiative at the New America Foundation, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, Natalie Foster, co-founder of the Rebuild the Dream organization, and from the University of California, Berkeley, former Labor Secretary Robert Reich. So welcome back. So far, we've looked deep into the abyss into which the American people were plunged in 2008 and the really scary prospects for our countries if conservative ideology prevails going forward. So let's shift gears now and focus on solutions that could actually work. A novel idea. What's it going to take to turn our economy around? What's it going to take to rebuild the middle class and create greater opportunities for all of us moving forward? So to kickstart this conversation, I want to play a video made by Natalie, your organization, Rebuild the Dream. Here, take a look at this.
The contract for the American Dream has 10 points. Point number 1, invest in America's infrastructure.
Point number 2, create 21st century energy jobs.
3, invest in public education. 4, Medicare for all.
5, make work pay.
6, secure Social Security. 7, return to fair tax rates.
8, tax Wall Street.
9, end wars and invest at home. 10, restore, protect, and renew democracy.
We've got to close the revolving door.
So, Natalie, how did you come up with these particular 10 points?
Yeah. Well, you know, last year, early in the year, people gathered in Wisconsin to stand with everyday heroes who were under attack, and tens of thousands of people came out, and people started tuning in from around the country, and it was clear that something was happening. So we partnered with Campaign for America's Future and MoveOn.org and a set of other partners to launch Rebuild the Dream. And the first thing we did was said, what are we about? You know, what is it that we want to see in the world? And so we turned to our members and asked them, and crowdsourced the answer. So 131,000 people came together and put in ideas for what they thought this country could do to get back on track. And then we took the best ones and met in house meetings around the country, and folks deliberated and came up with the 10-point contract for the American Dream, which you can crowdsourced, correct? The wisdom of the crowds, which you can see at rebuildthedream.com, and in fact endorse. Over 360,000 people have endorsed the contract for the American Dream, and that number is growing.
That's a substantial base. Robert Borosage, on point number 1, investing in infrastructure and creating green jobs. Chart 13 here shows the United States now ranks 16th in the world when it comes to infrastructure, behind Singapore, South Korea, and Iceland. Shouldn't this be seen as an opportunity, as an opportunity to rebuild America and use that as a stimulus, get everything, you know, an investment?
It's a huge opportunity and a huge imperative. You know, that 16th is sort of a neutral number. We're talking about bridges that are collapsing. We're talking about companies that lose markets because our infrastructure, our transport is so inefficient. We're talking about water that is increasingly dangerous to people's health because our clean water systems are antiquated. And now we can borrow money at near zero interest rates. We have a construction industry that's flat on its back with construction workers unemployed. There will never be a better opportunity to actually rebuild this infrastructure, to create an infrastructure bank that Leo Hindery has championed, to put the resources in to modernize the base of this economy and the base of the public health systems that are vital to the people.
Yeah. Robert Reich, Secretary Reich, on paying people a fair wage. I remember back in the 60s, there, you know, mechanization and automation and all this stuff was coming along. Time magazine actually did a special edition on the new leisure society that was supposed to be coming. The Jetsons cartoon, you know, George Jetson complained that his boss, Mr. Spacely, was a slave driver because he had to push the button 3 times a day. But instead, as we've seen with chart number 14, as productivity surged upward, wages stayed stagnant. All that extra wealth that was created by that extra productivity didn't go to the workers. It went to the shareholders. So how do we give workers the income they've earned and utilize automation to create a leisure society, or at least a more prosperous middle class?
Well, I think the key question, Tom, is how do you make sure that working people in this country have a fair share of the gains from productivity, like they used to have for 3 decades after the Second World War? The answer is, I think there's not one magic bullet, but there's several things that can be done. Number one, we need stronger unions, not only in manufacturing, but also in the service sector, where you've got so many millions of jobs, restaurant, retail, hotel, hospital, janitorial jobs. These people deserve unions. They need the bargaining leverage that unions give them, and they are not competing directly with foreigners. They're not even competing directly with computers. I mean, a lot of these people are in personal service work, and they need strong unions. Another thing, I would raise taxes on the top, and I would provide a much, much broader, as I alluded to before, something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a wage subsidy. I'd expand it to go right into the middle class, so average working people could get the benefit of higher wages. And the wealthy in this country would be, through their taxes indirectly, subsidizing those higher wages. I think Wall Street also needs to be confined. I mean, bring back Glass-Steagall, separate investment banking from commercial banking, also control and limit the size of those banks, cap the size of those banks, so we don't have a Wall Street that is driving companies to very, very short-term profit-making decisions instead of investing in their workforces, investing in job training, investing in developing the capacities of their workers. Don't get me started, Tom. I can go on for use up the entire rest of the program on this topic, but there's much, much that can be done. The good news is that we don't lack for ideas. The real challenge is getting the political mobilization, getting people mobilized and energized to do something about this.
Yeah, and a lot of those things that you've described are things that have worked in the past, are they not?
Absolutely. I mean, we knew how to do it. People ask me, what European country do you aspire that America becomes? And I say, no European country. What we should aspire to is what we had in this country for 3 decades after the Second World War, in which everybody grew together, as was referred to before, and which we had wide equality of opportunity, increasing equality of opportunity. We didn't have it, but we were seeking it. We also saw that the gains from economic growth and productivity went to a wide cross-section of America. We built a middle class in this country. We can do it again.
Yeah, and then Reagan came along and dropped the top tax rate from 74% down to 28%, and my wife says, my tombstone will say, it all started with Reagan. It's my mantra. Leo Hindery, there's a lot of animosity toward Wall Street right now. Not just because of what they did to their economy, but also because of how much money they're sucking out of the economy, and particularly in proportion to average American workers. Chart number 15 shows CEO pay to average worker pay has once again shot up, now 350 times greater on average. On Wall Street, it can be over 1,000 times greater. Beyond changing the business culture in America, what specific policies should we be putting in place to address this?
When you listen to the Secretary, and frankly you listen in the earlier segments to all of us, there is not a shortage of ideas. Natalie gave us some very compelling ones in her segment. There's not a shortage of good history. Franklin Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt gave us that history. What there is a fundamental absence of fairness. So on the chart about CEO compensation, that's the tip of a very big iceberg. But that iceberg is so fundamentally unfair. And when the Secretary stepped into the Clinton administration, he'll remember quite vividly, even though we were roughly 12 years into the Reagan Revolution, business in America still was very comfortable at the top, saying that it had concurrent and equal responsibility to employees, to shareholders, to communities, to customers, and to the nation. And at the end of his stewardship for President Clinton, in the most dramatic, unfair fashion possible, the Business Roundtable, the organization of the largest CEOs, Thom said to the Secretary and to the rest of the nation, it's shareholders only. And so this ballooning of CEO compensation, it's probably the most unconscionable evidence of this fundamental failure, this lack of fairness. Where did employees fall off the scale? Where did our communities, our nation itself, and even the customers that build these companies?
There was a time before when it was illegal, or at least you couldn't deduct it from taxes, for a company to compensate its senior officers with stock options. And when that changed, and I think it was during the Bush senior administration, when that changed, suddenly corporate culture seemed to change because the CEOs, instead of serving the employees and the company, started serving only the stockholders.
Well, Milton Friedman in 1970 tried to put this prospect forward that we would only serve shareholders, of whom a large portion should be management. And it was poo-pooed for decades, as the Secretary has said. And then suddenly it was just embraced. And so we sit out here with lots of signs of breakage. But we don't sit with a shortage of ideas, whether they be Natalie's on the macro side, the Secretary's on the employment side. What we lack completely is this fairness. And that's why the efforts of Heather and Natalie are especially important. Bob and I and the Secretary can talk about the theories and the solutions. But they are actually down there talking to the women and men who are being so adversely affected.
Yeah. Well, Natalie, we're also engaged in wars around the world. Chart number 16 here shows this is one of the reasons why our debt is so high, is because our defense budget has just gone off the scale. War spending is a significant part of our economy. How do we wind this down without causing economic damage now that our economy has been restructured to be a war economy?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say we were very pleased when the president ended the occupations and brought home the troops. And now I think it's important that we invest that money in jobs for this country. And we've done it before, and we can absolutely do it again.
So and so you just see this as a process that has started now, and we need to keep moving in that direction?
Yeah. Exactly.
And the idea of dismantling empire, I mean, the DOD budget has tripled since 1997. I think the last time that happened was World War II. Are there loud voices among your members and constituents who are saying, let's cut into that?
Yeah, absolutely. Folks have been saying that for years and years and years, that, you know, if we were to just invest a fraction in education, for example, that we invest in defense, that we would be an incredibly different country.
And yeah, we would be.
It's really important. This debate is too limited. The president's budget basically freezes the defense budget. It doesn't reduce it significantly. It doesn't change the way we're going to live in the world. It doesn't change our commitment to policing the entire world, which is preposterous and unaffordable. And what we need out of this teach-in, what we need out of citizens now, is a mobilization and an awareness and an education and a real investment in far bolder reforms than what we have in this country now, and they've got to change this debate.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we've been through a lot of big ideas about what it'll take to turn our economy around and make it work for the 99%. When we come back, how do we execute them? How do we transform politics to get politicians to lead boldly in a progressive direction?
Morning news today, violence has once again flared up.
These are the images the world has been seeing from the streets of Canada.
Giant corporations rule the day.
Download the official RT application to your iPhone or iPod Touch from the iTunes App Store. Watch RT live on the go. Video on demand, RT's live broadcasts, and RSS feeds now in the palm of your hand. Question more on RT.com.
Hello and welcome back. This is our final segment of the Teach-In to Take Back the American Dream. Tonight's special program has been a collaboration of the Campaign for America's Future, Rebuild the Dream, Move On, and Free Speech TV. We've touched a great deal on how our economy was plunged into its current mess and what it'll take to turn it around. Let's wrap up tonight's discussion by talking about how we can bring about the big changes in the U.S. economy that we so greatly need. Time for a little movement politics. So let me just throw this out. In fact, let me start with you, Secretary Reich, if that's all right. U.S. politics are so polarized right now. How do we get past that polarity? How do and bring either rationality to the political party process, or else just say, okay, if everybody's going to march in lockstep to Paul Ryan, we've got to make sure that the Democrats take the House and Senate as well as the White House.
Well, first of all, Tom, let me say that I am an optimist because you look back on American history, and every time the regressive forces have started to assemble and actually push the country, tried to push the country backwards, you've got progressives in this country. And you saw it, you know, after the Gilded Age, during the progressive era, first decades of the 1900s, the 20th century. You saw it again in the 1930s and 1940s. You saw it again in the 1960s. Progressives come together and they actually continue to push this country forward toward equal opportunity, toward more openness, toward more tolerance, toward a government that works for all of us. So it'll happen. The question is exactly how we are going to make it happen. I thought the Occupier movement, and I still think the Occupier movement has a great deal going for it. We've got to mobilize and activate and energize people at the grassroots and make sure that they understand this is not going to be slow. I mean, this is not going to be easy. It's not going to be fast. It's going to be a gradual process, like most reforms are, you know, have been in the past. We've got to make sure that people don't become cynical about politics. That cynicism is probably our worst enemy, because once we become cynical, the other side wins. Yeah. We've got to, in a sense, make sure that people understand that it's not just winning an election. It's once an election, if Obama is reelected, that's just the beginning of the process of putting pressure on Washington, on Democrats in Washington, on independents, and on Republicans as well, to move a progressive agenda.
Leo Hindery, you wanted to make a comment.
Tom, you know, I've always envied the Secretary's optimism. I sadly don't share it right now. I think that in the prior sort of jump backs that he talked about, where the progressives moved forward and took the country back and moved it in a more proper direction, that was all before Citizens United. And I find that this overwhelming tsunami of money from the same people that we decried in the earlier segments, that top 1%, 2%, 3%, whether they be the large multinational corporation or the very wealthiest of Americans, that is an overwhelming force. And so I'm less optimistic probably than I've ever been in my life about what we can do from here. I do think we have to look at the state of this particular Congress. It's almost paralyzed because of the election and because of the animus that developed over 2010 and 11.
But don't you think that there's a possibility of some blowback? I mean, look what happened in California when Carly Fiorina and Meg Whitman thought that they could just walk in and buy elections. They got kicked, you know, they got...
And so you're not going to see the wealthy candidate go forward with quite the embrace that we've seen in the past. That doesn't mean we're not going to spend $3 billion deciding who the next president of the United States is. Where I think Bob Borosage and I would say is, look, I think there are four things that Republicans and Democrats, progressives and conservatives, have said they could find some agreement around. One is the National Infrastructure Bank. One is what's called Buy Domestic, where we favor our manufacturers. Natalie is very conversant on the roughly 5 million out-of-school unemployed youth. There seems to be a fairly common embrace to that. And we also have to be extremely realistic about where we aren't in trade. China is just thumping us to death, notwithstanding the Vice Premier's visit last week. We have to go after their currency manipulation and their other trade abuses that Bob talks about all the time. Those four things could possibly happen even as we run up to the November elections. Right. But the optimism that the progressive movement that we sort of represent tonight could be the answer, I don't get it.
Heather Demos is very involved in, I've spoken in New York at your regular gigs a couple of times, and there's a lot of activity around MoveToAmend.org organization and other, some of these coalitions that are coming to actually say to the Supreme Court, no thank you, we're going to do like the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, we're going to reverse, which reversed Dred Scott, we're going to reverse Citizens United by amending the Constitution. Do you see that as a move forward, or do you have an alternative?
Yeah, I'm actually more optimistic because of Citizens United than I would have been after it. Because the fact is that our elections were being bought and sold by the highest bidder a long time before Citizens United. We really needed publicly financed elections before Citizens United. We had corporate lobbyists, of which there are 24 for every member of Congress, running Washington before Citizens United. But Citizens United was like a wake-up call to people. It really showed and crystallized for the American people what was wrong with their government. It wasn't that it was too big, it was who was paying for it, and that it was just a very narrow slice of our elite. So we have an opportunity in this country to actually create a movement that is going to galvanize progressives, Tea Party members, independents, and it's about taking back our democracy. And so there are a number of things we can do. The Disclose Act is just a basic sort of sunshine transparency. If you're going to be buying a bunch of political ads, if you're going to be spending in our elections, you've got to say who you are.
That was filibustered by the Republicans in the Senate, wasn't it?
Exactly, but it's back in this year, and it's incredibly, incredibly popular with the American people. So that's something quick that we could do this year. And then we got, of course, a constitutional amendment that could really change the balance of power and say that, you know what, democracy writes the rules of capitalism. Capitalism doesn't write the rules for our democracy.
I want to go back to Bob Reich's optimism, because in fact I do share it. I think, when you look at the beginning of the last century, the Gilded Age, the Congress was much more corrupt then. I mean, literally, Congress people were bought and sold and auctioned off on the cheap.
Unliterally,
well, as opposed to kind of mediated through an election system. Right. And so money was even more overwhelming then. Unions were literally illegal. They were a restraint of trade that the Supreme Court had ruled was unconstitutional. And it took a populist movement, a progressive movement, people challenging both parties in the streets, educating themselves, demanding change, and they passed the constitutional amendment to have an income tax. They changed banking in this system. They took on the money power. They curbed the power of the big trusts.
Direct election to the Senate.
Extraordinary reforms. Yeah. It took movement, and that's the lesson that Bob started with, and I think it's really important for people to see it. It doesn't happen through the electoral process. It doesn't happen through the two parties. They are now corrupted. It will take citizens in motion, cleansing this process and challenging it and putting forth very bold reforms and demanding a lot for this to change.
Which takes us to the Occupy movement, Natalie.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we have citizen voices in D.C., but I think it's also important that we have citizen voices challenging corporations in this country. A young woman on our staff who's 22 years old, graduated from college, no job, thousands in student debts, and Bank of America wanted to leverage a $5 fee, a fee on her credit card, and she said no. She started a petition, and it went viral, and it went around the country, and days later, Bank of America, backed down. So I actually think we live in an era where people can make a difference, and people coming together, can change the world.
It literally started, I remember that, when that happened, it started with one woman in your office.
One, at that time was not in our office, was an underemployed nanny, just like many millennials who'd graduated off a cliff, and she decided to do something about it. And I think you see that happening around the country, and that's certainly what the Occupy movement was about, where people saying we've had enough.
Other thoughts on how we can encourage this, make this play out?
Let's do more shows.
Leo. Secretary Reich, your thoughts on how this might play out and how we can encourage it to happen in a way that's healthy rather than destructive?
Well, I think, again, Tom, it's going to happen. The question is exactly how and when. I want to go back to something Bob Borosage was talking about. I mean, grassroots mobilization and energized citizenry, there's just simply no substitute for. I mean, going back to the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, the union movement, every time you want to challenge the structure of power in the society, you've got to do it, and can only do it through a citizens' movement at the grassroots. roots. And we're beginning to see that. And Leo, I respect your relative pessimism, but I've never seen among the young particularly, and I think what gives me cause for optimism is that I see young people all the time, people who are between the ages of 18, 25, 30 years old. They want to make a difference. They're determined to make a difference. They want to take back our democracy. They want to take back our economy. And it's because of them that we are going to see dramatic change.
Yeah. Final thoughts? Final 20 seconds here.
Berkeley.
Yeah. Okay. You do. You really do. Okay. Thank you very much. That'll do it for our special teach-in to take back the American dream. I want to thank our amazing panel this evening: Robert Borosage, Heather McGhee, Leo Hindery, Natalie Foster, and former Secretary Robert Reich, for your great insights. One final note: this can all seem forbidding. After all, this is the worst economic recession since the Great Depression, the greatest inequality since the eve of the Great Depression, the worst long-term unemployment since the Great Depression, the worst housing crisis since the Great Depression, the worst trade deficits ever, and college students carrying the deepest debt ever. But here's the reality. We have a pretty clear idea about the policies and the excesses that drove us off the cliff, and we have a pretty clear idea about major reforms vital to rebuild the middle class and revive the American dream. The question now is whether we, the people, can do enough mobilizing and organizing and educating and agitating to challenge the misrule of big money and special interests, of conservative ideas and corrupted politics. We've done it before, starting at the beginning of the last century when populist and progressive movements challenged the reign of the robber barons. Now we have no choice but to do it again. As Occupy Wall Street has shown us, don't agonize, organize. Remember, democracy begins with you. Get out there, get active, tag, you're it. We'll see you tomorrow.